in order to be able to apply everything that we've been talking about and other things as well to the right key, is that you have to know where the notes fall, where they lay on the guitar. And if you think about that in a much smaller sense, I think it makes more sense. So one of the coolest things that I could have ever done was to practice learning scales on a single string. It sounds like, why would anybody ever do that? But there's a really good reason why, and I'll show you. So again, sticking with E minor, on the high E string, if you just play all the notes starting with the open E that are in the key, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C, D, E, you can go up as high as you want. Right? That's just on one string. It's also called the Aeolian scale, and it has the same notes as G major. So there's going to be one sharp, which is an F sharp. So the sound of the scale is like. So on one string, you're just going to play all those notes as they conform to the scale. On the high E string, it would be. I mean, you can literally play that by using one finger, you know, to play all the notes if you want. Or you can play them in groups where you're shifting position. Doesn't really matter. The idea is that you want to find where those notes lay on the single string. On the B string as well. And ultimately, you want to do it on all the strings. But we'll just start with that, the B string and the E string. So one of the things to start to now identify, now that you see where the notes are on the string, is if you're playing in one of the most typical fashions, which is where you play 3 notes on a string, or using 3 fingers to play a scale, there are certain repeating shapes that make up any scale. So this is really easy. There's only 3 that make up a single string scale. So one of them, we'll call it shape number 1, is using your first finger, your second, and your fourth. So 1, 2, 4. All right? The second shape, I'm going to skip up to this position, is when you play 1, 3, 4. And the third shape is where there's a stretch, so where there's a whole step between both fingers. And you can play that either 1, 2, 4, or as the frets start to get smaller, 1, 3, 4. So what you're going to see is those 3 shapes kind of repeating themselves as you're going up. So check it out. So here's the first shape. Here's the next one. Right, so this whole scale on one position could be just broken down into these 3 fingering shapes. And it's going to be the same thing on any string you pick. Right? If I pick A string. G string. All right, so you take something like super simple, you know, one note or a scale on a single string, break it down to something a little bit more complicated, just these 3 shapes, but it's still really simple. Mm-hmm. And you see how it applies to all the strings. This is going to come in really handy in a couple of seconds. So the next step, to take it to the next level, it's one thing to play something on a single string, right? And there's plenty of licks and things you can do on a single string. But what about when you start to combine 2 strings, one string to the next, which is how we get through scales and licks and stuff like that. Right. So it's an important technique. All you have to do is you have to figure out where those shapes are on one string, where they are on the next string, and put them together. So as an example, again, in E natural minor, let's say I'm going between the D and the G string. Right? So on the D string, here are those shapes on one string. On the G string, here they are. And And if you just play 3 notes on one and then 3 notes on the next, you have this kind of 6-note shape. And if you move that to each position and let your hand conform to the scale, then all of a sudden you have a scale passage through a larger number of strings, right? So we went from a single string, now we're going to 2 strings. And even with that, remember how I said there are 3 different shapes? There are, how many are there? There's 6 different 2-string shapes, right? There's only 6, and they repeat all over the neck.
Yeah.
So the first one's like this, where it's 1, 3, 4 on each string. So it's like it's a parallel shape. Fingers stay the same. The second one is where you have 1, 2, 4 on each string. The second one is where you have 1, 2, 4 with the stretch, so a whole step between each. The next one is where you have 1, 3, 4, and 1, but then 1, the stretch on the next one. So you can play 1, 3, 4, 1, 3, 4 with a stretch. Or you can play it like this. 1, 2, 4, 1, 2, 4 with a stretch.
1, 2, 3, you meant.
1, 2, 3. Thank you. The 1, 2, 3, 4. The 5th shape is where you have 1, 2, 4, and 1, and 1, 3, 4 on the next. And the 6th shape is where you have the stretch on the lower string, 1, 2, 4, and then 1, 2, 4 on the higher string. And then the 7th, if you were to continue up, the 7th one is just a repeat of the 3rd one. So the cool thing is that if you learn those 6 little patterns, that's all you need to know, really. They're all over the guitar. They just repeat.
Well, yeah, and the bottom
everywhere.
4 strings are all tuned in fourths.
They're all tuned in fourths, so it's
6,
really
5,
simple.
5, 4, 4, 3.
Yeah, exactly. So all those shapes. They're all going to repeat in string groups. It's a little tricky between the B and the G because you have the tuning's different. It's a third, so you have to do a little shift. They don't sit like where most of them are on adjacent frets, right? You have to do a little shift. But it's really the concept's the same. You just have to adjust for that little string tuning. And then, if you even go back to the first or the second thing we talked about, which is playing all those techniques through a scale, that scale is just comprised of these shapes. They're just kind of going up this way as opposed to going this way. Right, so here's one of them. Another one. Right, and really, if you just know those 6, you can get up and down the guitar. You just have to conform your fingers to the notes in the key. Now, to take it to one more level, just to see how you can apply this in a way that will enable you to cover more ground on the guitar, and this is something I do all the time, is the concept that these shapes all, if you start, let's say, on the low E to A string, they repeat in octaves, in 3 octaves. So if we go back to our 7th position shape, if you go an octave higher than that and play those same notes between the D and the G string, the shape is exactly the same. If you go one more octave between the B and the B and the E string, then it's the same exact shapes. The fingering doesn't change at all. That's a really important concept about playing guitar that people should know, is that idea that there are these octaves that keep repeating all over the place. Because when you learn something in one spot, you can just shift it up, and
Right.
there it is again, and you're in the same key. Shift it up, there it is again. So your mind starts to become really familiar with the way that these shapes look and how they sound against the chords.
Sure.
If you want to make that an actual completed scale, because we're skipping a note,
Right.
there's only 6 notes here. So if you want to actually complete the scale, what I do, very simply, after you play the 6th note, I shift up to the next position, which is where the next one's going to start anyway. So now it's a 7-note pattern. And now you have a scale that ascends 3 octaves, where you can identify the shapes really simply and easily, and it's going up. And back down. So it's a good way of getting up and down a scale pretty effortlessly. And it spans a lot of space there.
Yeah,
Look at all that.